Upon waking, a peculiar tingling sensation coursed through my legs as I found myself alone, firmly secured to an operating table, my surroundings an enigma. Panic set in as I surveyed the room, realizing I was connected to a plethora of machines, an IV needle piercing my arm. The worst part was my complete lack of awareness regarding my whereabouts. It felt as though I had been drugged, or that my memory had been mercilessly erased, leaving me in a state of disoriented oblivion. In that moment, fear engulfed me like never before, rendering me utterly helpless. An intense ache gnawed at my stomach, my head swam in a fog, and my mouth was parched. Attempting to cry out for assistance, my voice emerged as nothing more than a feeble croak. My limbs refused to obey my frantic commands. The overwhelming terror gripped me, and I remained alone, my calls for help vanishing into the abyss of isolation. After what seemed like an eternity, a woman entered the room. Draped in a white robe and concealed behind a white mask, she resembled a character from a horror film, intensifying my unease. Was I inside a hospital? Upon realizing my wakefulness, she began speaking to me in an unintelligible language. Her tone held an unsettling edge, and I couldn't decipher her words. Desperation drove me to wriggle my hands and legs, struggling to break free from the machines that held me captive. "Release me!" I screamed through the pain, but the nightmare showed no signs of abating. The eerie woman approached, lifting the blanket and raising my gown, unveiling a sizable bandage on my abdomen. Tears welled in my eyes as a newfound horror surged through me. What had they subjected me to? My cries escalated in volume, reverberating with a heightened sense of dread. Summoning a surge of strength, I wrested my hand free, tearing off the bandage despite the searing pain. Beneath it, I discovered a fresh scar held together by stitches. I had been incised, and a barrage of terrifying thoughts raced through my mind. Perhaps I had been drugged and transported here to have my organs harvested for the nefarious black market. Various horrifying scenarios raced through my mind. I entertained the notion that I had been kidnapped and would remain a captive until my parents coughed up their life savings as ransom. Alternatively, I contemplated the grim possibility that I had met a gruesome fate and my family would never uncover my lifeless body. As these nightmarish thoughts consumed me, I lost all semblance of composure. My screams intensified, and I resorted to desperate flailing, lashing out at the nurse in my terror. I must emphasize that violence is not a typical aspect of my character. However, I had been gripped by such overwhelming fear that I had surrendered control to sheer panic. The pain in my abdomen escalated, diverting my attention to the source. Blood seeped from my stitches, intensifying my alarm. An alarm sounded, summoning more nurses into the room. Two of them swiftly immobilized my arms, while another secured my legs. Now, my fear had reached an even greater crescendo. I was trapped entirely at their mercy, with no ability to resist their actions. A doctor entered, looming over the bed, his tall frame and menacing countenance amplifying my anxiety. What happened next only deepened my dread. I had been so preoccupied with his demeanor that I hadn't noticed his actions, but I abruptly experienced a searing pain in my arm. I couldn't discern the nature of the intrusion, but my vision began to blur, and an overwhelming drowsiness enveloped me. He must have administered something to induce unconsciousness. Paralyzed and defenseless, I succumbed to the drug's effects, my eyes shutting tight, unable to reopen them. The duration of my slumber remained a mystery until I awoke once more. Upon stirring, I noticed a plate of peculiar-looking food nearby, presumably meant for me. The unappetizing, mashed appearance and offensive odor of the food failed to deter my gnawing hunger, and I devoured most of it. The room remained devoid of any presence, and the effects of the drugs gradually waned. It was during this period that fragmented memories of my recent past began to resurface, gradually piecing together the events leading up to this bewildering situation. I realized I was not in my home country, but my recollections were hazy. I distinctly recalled traveling abroad for my 14th birthday with my two best friends, Audrey and Stella. These fragments of memory were like puzzle pieces, slowly assembling to provide some context to my current predicament. I hadn't been alone. My dad had accompanied me on that trip. My head throbbed with pain as the memories rushed back, sending a fresh wave of panic surging through me. I recalled our recent presence on the bustling streets of Malaysia, where we had indulged in fried squid from a food vendor. However, something had gone terribly wrong. The crowded streets had grown chaotic, and as I walked alongside my father and friends, A sharp pain had flared in my stomach, a consequence of my culinary adventures. At first, I had assumed it was a normal reaction to trying new foods, but then my father and friends had vanished from my sight, leaving me alone amidst the tumult. The agony in my stomach had intensified and anxiety had gripped me as I searched in vain for them. That had been the last coherent memory I possessed, being lost in a foreign country, utterly alone. It now provided context to the bewildering situation I found myself in. Evidently, a gang had kidnapped me, capitalizing on my vulnerable and disoriented state. The pieces were finally falling into place, and a profound terror enveloped me, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I needed to escape, and I needed to do it quickly. My thoughts were disrupted when the same woman in the white mask re-entered the room, clutching pills she insisted I take. Refusing wasn't an option. 2 other men accompanied her, leaving me with no choice. I decided to outsmart them by pretending to swallow the pills, secretly concealing them beneath my tongue and discreetly spitting them out once they departed. It was clear that I had to find a way out of this place, and I was determined to do just that the following morning. Upon waking, I found myself in a daze, too weak and disoriented to move, despite the overwhelming fear that consumed me. Gazing up at a man wearing a blue mask who stood over me, tears welled in my eyes. I mustered every ounce of politeness I could summon, beseeching him to let me leave. I pleaded, hoping that his sympathy might lead to my release. To my astonishment, the man in the blue mask summoned another individual who appeared to have some command of English. When I reiterated my plea to leave, he responded loudly, "Money or no leave." I urgently explained, "I don't have any money." His reply was chilling, "That's a big problem. Your parents will pay." My appeals seemed to fall on deaf ears, and it became painfully evident that my captors were indifferent to my well-being. Fears raced through my mind. What would they do if I couldn't meet their demands? Would they harm me, or had they already begun harvesting my organs for sale? Tears streamed down my face despite my efforts to reason with the man. Eventually, the 2 men relented and left me alone in the room. After some time, I managed to regain my composure and realized that escape was my only option. My arms and legs remained tightly bound, but with determined effort, I succeeded in freeing my left arm. I painstakingly undid the restraints on my right arm and legs. Though dizzy and in pain, I sat up, paying little heed to my aching stomach. Surveying my surroundings, I noted that I wore only a robe and my feet were bare. In the room, I spotted a bag containing clothes and shoes that struck me as familiar. Despite a sharp pain in my arm, I managed to remove the IV needle, suppressing a scream as it left me in anguish, causing my blood to spatter across the room. I hurriedly donned the clothes and shoes, then cautiously cracked open the door. Outside, an empty hallway stretched before me, and I understood that this might be my sole opportunity before my captors returned. I darted out of the room and raced down the corridor. As I reached the end, I encountered a door that I pushed open. On the other side, I found numerous people lying in beds, surrounded by individuals adorned in masks and gloves. The 2 men who had confronted me earlier were among them, and upon spotting me, they sprinted in my direction, their anger palpable. Panic surged as I scanned the room for an exit, finally spotting a door leading to the outside. I sprinted towards the door and threw myself against it, my dizziness nearly causing me to collapse as I tumbled onto the floor outside. Despite my wobbly legs, I couldn't afford to pause. Summoning every ounce of determination, I picked myself up and resumed running, propelled by the urgency of escaping my captors. I found myself in an unfamiliar country, surrounded by strange sights, unusual buildings, unfamiliar cars, and unfamiliar faces. Navigating this alien environment proved daunting, but the only thing that mattered was putting distance between myself and the place where I had been imprisoned. I pressed on, though I could hear screams echoing behind me. However, my legs eventually gave way, and I crumpled to the ground. Unable to stand, I resorted to crawling, but soon felt arms encircling me. I screamed and cried out about my kidnapping, yet the passers-by continued on, heedless of my plight. Moments later, a sharp pain shot through my arm, plunging me into darkness. As the light faded, I resigned myself to what seemed like the end. Then, in a surreal twist, I awakened to the sound of loud voices in my vicinity. Upon opening my eyes, I discovered 3 policemen standing over me, engaged in conversation with my captors. A wave of realization crashed over me. My abductors had indeed kidnapped me. I screamed, frantic for help, but the officers appeared perplexed, unable to comprehend my words. How could this situation be real? Desperation gripped me until I heard familiar voices. My parents rushed into the room, their faces etched with relief upon seeing me. My mother's eyes welled with tears. Panic consumed me as I continued to insist, "They kidnapped me." However, my parents began to laugh, dismissing my claims as silly. "They are doctors," my parents explained. Then they clarified that I hadn't been kidnapped. Something entirely different had occurred. As my father recounted the events, it became clear that when I had gotten lost previously, he had been unable to locate me. Upon returning to my last known location, I had vanished. As it turned out, I had collapsed in sheer panic on the sidewalk, overwhelmed by excruciating stomach pains. I had to be swiftly transported to the hospital, where the doctors made a startling discovery: my appendix had ruptured. They explained that a combination of shock, stress, and the unfamiliar foods I had consumed likely triggered this medical crisis. Meanwhile, my parents had faced their own ordeal trying to locate me, adding to the overall stress of the situation. In the end, I couldn't have been more relieved that the nightmarish ordeal had come to an end. I found myself profusely apologizing to the doctors who had treated me for the ordeal I had inadvertently put them through.